For the past few months, the Gibraltar Area School District has discussed proposed policies surrounding non-discrimination. This in relationship now to those who identify as transgender or non-conforming.
In determining when and how to implement these policies, the district would consider how long they have identified, support from parents, or sought counseling in coming to this decision. Samantha Cavalli listened into that meeting and has more on why parents are concerned with the wording of the policies.
It really worries me that adults at the last school board meeting and also tonight are so fearful of transgender kids.
The main objectives or objections or thoughts about this don't have anything to do with anything except bathrooms and locker rooms.
Beginning earlier this school year, the Gibraltar Area School District Policy Committee proposed multiple policies surrounding non-discrimination guidelines. The first policy is regarding students who are transgender or are non-conforming to gender role stereotypes. The second policy looks at non-discrimination guidelines as it relates to locker room and bathroom usage for transgender and non-gender conforming students. Some parents were concerned about students who identify as one gender one day and another the next. Policy Committee Chair Jessica Souter said there would be a decision made as to what the student would use.
For my daughter, with no history of any preferred behaviors, no counseling, nothing like that, and said, tomorrow I'm going to go use the opposite sex restroom because that's what I feel like. That's not allowed, no.
A third proposed policy would make sure everything from toilet stalls to locker room changing and showering areas had the necessary privacy for people of all genders. While construction occurs, people can use the segregated bathroom or locker room consistent with their identity or request to use a unisex bathroom. Knapp is the mother of a transgender child. While some say this is about kids, their anatomy, and who is safe, Knapp wants to make sure the focus isn't on transgender kids being dangerous.
I want to make sure that we don't focus on this picture of the transgender kid as being dangerous. And I believe that the policies that you currently have are really needed because of some of this depiction that is presented here. So please do keep the wording that was presented and approve all three policies next week.
Samantha Cavalli, Action 2 News, Gibraltar.